Hi everyone, welcome again to AuthorStory. I'm Alexander Lim, your host, and for this episode, I'm interviewing Mark Antonacci, author of the book Test the Shroud. And for those of you following along who are interested, you can go over now to the Amazon link in the description below the video and check out or get a copy of the book. So Mark, welcome to AuthorStory. Thanks for being our guest.
My pleasure.
Cool. So, Mark, to start off, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself? What's your author story?
Um, Over 35 years ago, I was an agnostic who stumbled on the subject of the Shroud of Turin. And what I stumbled onto was the first summary of the scientific articles that were being released by a group of scientists who comprehensively studied the Shroud. This would have been 39 years ago. And they were just releasing it, and I just had no idea there was such a garment like this, or it had any kind of evidence of the type they were talking about. I don't think most people had any idea, and they still don't.
Right. Okay, and so over the course of the years, then you got involved in the research and in investigating about it. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So, Mark, about the book, would you mind telling us a little bit more about it and what it's all about?
Well, I discuss every piece of relevant evidence that relates to the Shroud of Turin. What happens when you start off investigating its authenticity, you necessarily get into a much larger question, and that is questions such as, is this a real human being? Did he really suffer an extensive series of wounds? And was he crucified? Was he killed? And did some type, how in the world were these two full-length images and 130 unique blood marks encoded onto the cloth?
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So you did mention a little earlier that the Shroud of Turin is not particularly well known. I mean, you yourself, you admit you haven't heard about it for quite some time. Can you just give a little bit background? What is the Shroud of Turin, and what is supposedly so interesting about it?
Okay, shrouds are burial garments. They're made out of linen. They've been used in the Middle East and elsewhere for thousands of years. Jesus was buried in a shroud. The thing about the Shroud of Turin is that, unlike any other cloth or blanket or sheet or shroud or anything remotely like it, there's two full-length images and 130 blood marks distributed throughout both of these images. And these are the images of a human being who incurred the same wounds that Jesus did, under all the same circumstances of time, instruments, executioners, barriers, location, things like that. And the question becomes, is it a forgery, or is it really Jesus's burial garment?
Okay, interesting. Or it might have been okay. Well, maybe we'll cover this later, but I'm thinking it might have been another crucifixion victim, or someone like that. But okay, I got that.
Yes, that's an issue.
Yeah. So, if I may ask, when did the Shroud of Turin really start first appearing? What's the first historical mention of it in the record?
Well, um, it's had a history in Europe since the mid 1300s. If it is also a very similar cloth with famous image on it, was kept in the Byzantine Empire for centuries, and prior to that, it was in another location in modern day Turkey. called Edessa.
Mhm.
And so, if it's the same garment, um, these garments and images have been mentioned for centuries,
Mhm.
and they have a first century attribution as well.
Oh, okay. So, and of course, that's assuming that this is the same garment that's been mentioned throughout the centuries. Then.
Yes, and the descriptions and the copies of these are very, very similar to what you would see on the shroud with the naked eye. In
Oh.
other words, I don't know how many of the viewers realize this, but the images on the shroud, um, as you apply modern technology to it, such as photography or photographic enlargement or UV light or all kinds of computer imaging devices, you acquire a great deal more evidence from the cloth. And one of the ways you acquire more evidence is the resolution becomes so much better when you take a photograph of the cloth as seen with the naked eye. You get a highly resolved photographic quality positive image. They discovered this by accident at the dawn of the 20th century, and then they realized that this cloth that had been well known for centuries, the images on those cloth were negatives.
Mm-hmm.
And
Interesting.
and when you see the positive, um, you see all so much more evidence. There's a couple of basic reasons for that. You get a light dark reversal when you go to the positive, and the resolution is just excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it, you can't. It's hard to believe that you're looking at an image on cloth because it has the resolution of what you would see on photographic paper.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay, interesting. So, Mark, if I may ask, I mean, you did mention that this is about an image on a cloth. How commonplace or how rare is this? I mean, I'm sure there might have been other shroud samples from 2,000 years ago. Um, is this commonplace, or is this just this particular shroud alone?
Oh, it's completely unique. There's no other images on burial cloths or any other cloths that are remotely like this. This is two full-length images with 130 uniquely aligned blood marks
Mhm.
throughout the front and back length and width of the images.
Right. Okay, cool. So, okay, great. So this is definitely a unique artifact and a very unique object.
Oh yes.
All
Oh
right.
yes.
All right. Interesting. Interesting. Okay, so Mark, I mean, you did mention that, there's already been quite a bit of testing that's already been done on the shroud. And of course, the testing methodologies improve as technologies improve and as, scientific methodologies improve as well. What sort of testing has already been done on the shroud, and why has this, in your opinion, not proved conclusive?
Um, excuse me. Almost 40 years ago,
Hmm.
um, the shroud was examined comprehensively and scientifically for the only time in its life. And they did an excellent job. They focused on non-destructive, all the forms of non-destructively examining the shroud.
Hmm.
And it did yield a wealth of information. Um, Thousands of tests have been undertaken on the cloth as a whole and on samples removed from the cloth. Only one result is inconsistent with the cloth's authenticity
Hmm.
as the burial garment of Jesus Christ. That is how consistent the evidence is.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, this one test result is the one that most of the public and the media discuss or talk about. And
Hmm.
this is this was actually one of the most controversial tests ever conducted in all of science. 1988, after a belabored 8-year process to radiocarbon date the shroud, they finally did it in 1988. Keep in mind, originally it was planned that this was just one area of additional testing that would have been done 10 years after this first comprehensive one in 1978. Out of 26 areas of investigation that were supposed to occur, only one area of investigation occurred, and that was a radiocarbon dating that never followed any of the scientific protocols that were laid out about radiocarbon dating. Originally, it was agreed that samples would be taken from several locations on the shroud, at least 2 or 3. They took one sample from one corner, cut it into 3 pieces, and everyone dated it. And within a tiny area, you have the ages change close to 40 years over a 5-centimeter period. It's just the dates change so much in this short period of time. Data said there's something wrong. There's something systematically wrong with these. We don't know what it is, but the dates are changing too much. Something is, and the laboratories were supposed to share this raw data with other analyzing institutions.
Right.
They didn't do it at all. They just took the data and fudged it. They started averaging Arizona, the laboratory in Arizona, the carbon dating laboratory, took 8 different dates over the course of 4 days. And in order to try to get the numbers within an acceptable range, they averaged. They averaged the dang dates into 4 dates. And what those averages does is it cuts your outliers down.
Right.
And this is not proper. What they should have done is shared the data with the other organizing institutions and say, look, if they'd gotten another sample from another location, you would have got a very different date. We take the position that every date on the Shroud of Turin is incorrect, and it is an entire variety of dates that are incorrect. We think the cloth, I'll try to cut to the heart of the matter, we think the cloth was irradiated by particle radiation. It's hard to fathom this, but the evidence keeps continuing to point in that direction. If the cloth was irradiated with particle radiation, think of it as primarily consisting of protons and neutrons. These neutrons would have created radioactive atoms all over the cloth. And one of those radioactive atoms is carbon-14. These radioactive atoms can only be created by neutrons. The carbon-14 that we're all familiar with in our atmosphere is created in the atmosphere by neutrons. It's just found on the Earth it's acquired by photosynthesizing plants that absorb it from the atmosphere and spread it throughout the Earth. But it's created by neutrons up in the atmosphere. If this man released particle radiation from his body, it would have increased the carbon-14 content all over the cloth. But the thing about it is, there's 2 things. One, it would have created other radioactive atoms, which would confirm this. And these 2 can only be created by neutrons. But the second thing is, the distribution of these additional carbon-14 atoms would be in proportion to their closeness to the body and their position on the body.
Hmm.
And in other words, the thicker parts of the body would issue more of these neutrons. The thinner parts of the body, like the ankles, would issue less. But if you dated a sample from the body image, it would date well into the future, thousands of years into the future. It's an impossible result. You can't date something to the future. You can't accurately date it. Carbon dating assumes that the carbon-14 atoms that they count in the sample is original. It goes back to the time when the the flax plant in this case was harvested and woven into a textile.
Hmm.
But you would have added, this event would have added a great deal of carbon-14 atoms. If you test the cloth at the atomic level, you would prove that.
Okay, I got that. Okay, so interesting. So, first, let me just clarify on a point. So, you mentioned the carbon-14 testing done by labs. You mentioned like one lab got four different dating results over four different dates. Does this mean that they tested the same sample that they got uh, once on each of those days?
Well, on 4 different days, Arizona took two dates. So they had 8 samples
Eight
and
samples. Okay.
eight dates, yes, from one sample.
Oh,
And
okay.
and what they did is, in order to minimize the outliers, they averaged
Mm,
each day's dates.
interesting.
For example, and what that does is it cuts down the outliers.
Right.
It makes them much smaller, and they're trying to get it within an acceptable range of variance.
Hmm.
And that's how they had to do it. All they had to do was share this with other analyzing institutions, which they agreed to do. The British Museum, the Oxford Laboratory convinced Arizona this is what they should do, and Arizona went along with it. The other go ahead.
So, if I may ask, is this like the common way by which carbon dating is done, or is this just an anomaly?
That type of averaging is not usually done, and there
Mm,
was no need to do that. Um, we're not suggesting that they miscounted the number of carbon-14 atoms.
right.
They just make an improper conclusion that all these atoms are remain from the time that the cloth was woven. That's an assumption that is not necessarily true, and they should have taken more samples from different locations. If they would have asked for it and they would have shared this data, they would have saw, hey, this data is inconclusive and indicates that something systematic is wrong with it. And one very real possibility is this area is irradiated with particle radiation, and as the sample, it's taken from the lower left-hand corner. As you go up the cloth, the dates start getting younger.
Hmm.
It's getting just a little bit closer to the body, the bulk of the body, and it's showing big numbers, bigger numbers than you would expect over a 5 centimeter area. And that's one of the main mistakes. And they knew next to nothing about the subject and lobbied for 8 years. Harry Gove, their leader
Hmm.
of the carbon dating laboratories for this procedure, lobbied for 8 years to eliminate the test in the other 25 areas. And at the same time, and he admits this in writing, it was to eliminate the other scientists because I guess they were hogging the limelight. I don't know what Harry Go's motivation was, but it worked. And you eliminated the scientist who knew most about the cloth at all from even being there. They could have suggested right there you should have gotten samples from different locations, as they had argued for years. This was one of the most controversial and haphazard and cavalier efforts ever to be seen. And they had no idea what they were working on, and they just assumed, like everyone else did, well, how could the Shroud of Turin be Jesus's burial garment? We've never heard of this before. They made, and you could prove it if you tested the shroud at the atomic level.
Okay, so what are some of the tests that you do propose to prove or disprove the authenticity of the shroud?
Well, you could prove that every location on the cloth was irradiated with neutrons, and that the amount of neutrons they got is directly correlated to its closeness or distance from the body or its position on the body. That would tell you right there that yes, it's not only irradiated with neutrons, but the neutrons are coming from the length, width, and depth of the body. You've got evidence for a miraculous event that's consistent with the resurrection. All of the other evidence indicates you have a real person who was not only crucified, but he was scourged with a Roman instrument. He was crowned over the entire head with a group of sharp-pointed objects. And in this case, you find pollens from a thorn branch, about 90 pollens from a thorn branch that only grows in Jerusalem and the surrounding area. You've got a post-mortem side wound from which blood and water flowed. You've got nails in the wrist, which is the correct location. You've got a man who incurred all the wounds that Jesus did. You've got proof for not only the shroud's authenticity, but that every element of the passion, crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection occurred. You have this man who's been buried according to detailed Jewish burial customs of the Second Temple period as well. And most of this evidence cannot be forged.
Right, cool. Okay. So, I was going to ask, yeah. So really, this is, if I may ask, the tests that you're proposing, are these like non-destructive tests? Like they don't have to cut up the shroud to see this thing?
We're proposing to be tested at the atomic and the molecular levels. The molecular testing is completely non-destructive. The atomic testing, you would have to destroy some samples, but they're not very big. It would be minimally invasive. You could get billions of these radioactive atoms from one dot of blood from the man in the shroud, and this blood is much richer in elements that would be converted to radioactive atoms, much more richer than, say, linen. Blood is just denser with more material. You could take the underlying piece of cloth underneath that blood, and you would have very, very minimal damage to the cloth. Now, we don't propose that any atomic testing be done until these tests to detect these radioactive atoms are perfected, and that you can do it every single time. And we're working now on control samples, control linen, control blood samples. This technique has already developed for harder objects such as limestone. For example, Jesus's burial tomb, his reputed burial tomb at the Holy Sepulchre has recently been excavated. If this is Jesus' burial tomb, and such a neutron radiating event occurred in that tomb, if there's any original parts of those walls left, you would find these radioactive atoms inside those limestone walls, and no other limestone wall in the world would have these. It would indicate where such an event occurred. But this testing is so sophisticated, you could actually determine not only if such a miraculous event occurred, you could determine when it occurred. And I might add that other scientific dating techniques have been applied to the shroud. Just in the last couple of years, some new techniques have been invented. And these indicate that the cloth is from the 1st century, as does other evidence derived from the Shroud of Turin. The carbon-14 date is an outlier in many, many respects.
Right, right. Okay, interesting, interesting. So yeah, definitely, definitely interesting information right there. Yeah. So Mark, let's say you met up with a person who has seen a religious relic, is interested in a religious relic, something like the shroud, might believe in it, and you had only enough time to tell him one thing about how the scientific method can be best applied to prove or disprove the validity of this relic. What would be that one thing you would tell that person? Why would you say that?
Well, if the relic was a Shroud of Turin, I would say test it at the atomic and the molecular levels. They could also do more follow-up DNA testing that may add or subtract from the other evidence that indicates this man has a Jewish heritage. The last DNA testing was done in the mid 1990s, and it indicated it's ancient blood of a male. But now they're more refined, and they can indicate more things. I'm not trying to say that Jesus has any ancestors that you could match the blood to, but you could match the blood to more of a Jewish population from the Middle East, things like that, perhaps.
Right, cool, interesting, interesting. So yeah, very interesting. So Mark, in the last few minutes of this interview, this is an interesting topic. I wish we could talk more, but we're coming towards the interview now. So, in the last few minutes of this interview, are there any words of wisdom you would like to share to inspire our listeners?
Well, yeah. Stop and think about the central premises of any religion or philosophy, such as agnosticism or atheism or any other philosophy of life. What kinds of objective or independent evidence do you have for the central premises of how to live or how to acquire life after death? Humanity has never had any objective or independent evidence, let alone extensive scientific and medical evidence relating to the central premises of a religion or a philosophy that also provides a path for life after death. Life after death, no one, not even the most ardent evolutionists, think that you acquire life after death by evolution. You don't. It's like being born. It's not something that you plan that occurs. Not the baby doesn't do that. It's just a free gift. You could have the humanity might have only documented path, if you will, or evidenced path to life after death from this evidence. This is worth looking into. And if somebody has more evidence for the central premises of some other philosophy or how you acquire life after death, then fine. But this is something to look into. This evidence is relevant to everyone who might possibly die someday.
Just about
This,
all of us, I reckon.
yes, this is inevitable, and this relates to the question. Uh, uh, this same individual says, if you believe in my resurrection, you too can have life after death. And the qualifications, if you will, are pretty simple. They can be summarized pretty much by the love your neighbor as you would yourself, something very basic. It's not all that complicated. It really isn't. It's just the evidence has never been available before.
Right, right, cool, interesting right there, interesting there. Okay, cool. So, in closing, then, the book is Test the Shroud. The author is our guest, Mark Antonacci. And you can find the book on Amazon as well as on the websites testtheshroud.com, that's testtheshroud.com, one word, as well as on testtheshroud.org. So, Mark, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for being an author story. It was very insightful having you here with us today.
You're welcome, and the book's supposed to also start appearing in bookstores about now.
Cool, fantastic. So, great timing. So, any of you listeners, you heard Mark what Mark said. So, if you want to know more about this fascinating relic, go to a bookstore. It should be there soon. And if you want to get it online, please do so right now by going to the Amazon link in the description below the video. And if you'd like to follow our author interviews on YouTube, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. So, bye for now, everyone. I'll be back on Author Story next time with another inspiring author.